Talk. How are you?
Fine, good to see you. How are you doing?
I am very well, thank you. Delighted to be on the program. Thank you for inviting me to the tackle. I look forward to our next 2 hours. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Good to see you. I
How is
actually appreciate
Nairobi?
the honor. I appreciate the fact that you've actually honored our invite to the tackle. You know, you're a great woman who has made moves in East Africa, or is it the whole of Africa actually? Right? So we are pleased to have you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Gerald.
Mm-hmm. I can see you really looking good this morning. You don't look like someone who Museveni has been chasing around for very many years.
What were you expecting to see, Gerald?
You know, someone who has been fighting with a dictator for several years. You can expect you to see them with scars and all. I mean, you're looking nice. Good to see you.
The scars are emotional more than physical.
Wow, sorry about that. Anyway, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the tacklers. You're majorly, I've seen also you have some Ugandans who have joined in, but we have a majorly Kenyan audience and also guys from diaspora.
Right, so perhaps I should share the link to the Facebook Live on my timeline as well.
Sure.
So that we have more Ugandans defending me when the Kenyans accost me, or more Kenyans defending me when the Ugandans come after me.
Actually, Kenyans love you.
Oh, I love Kenyans as well. I love Kenya. It's been my refuge twice now. This is my second time I'm running to Kenya for a refuge. When I was a child, my mother and father had to flee from oppression in our country, Uganda, in the early 80s. And so I lived as a refugee child. That time we were living in Langata in Nairobi in Kenya. And then I've run back to Kenya with my children. So Kenya is a place I love. It's become a refuge, a hiding place for me, as it was for my parents. So I appreciate the love, and I hope that Kenya will be good to my children and I this time as well.
All right. So does that mean then that you guys you have an history of activism as well from your parents, or how did they end up in Kenya as refugees?
My father was a medical doctor. He was heading Mbarara Hospital, National Referral Hospital, when your dictator Idi Amin was president of Uganda, and Mbarara National Referral Hospital was on the highway that introduced soldiers from Tanzania. Right, if you remember, our country had a bunch of soldiers working with Obote, and they got into our country and they were fighting against Idi Amin Dada's army. And my father was responsible for leading a hospital that was treating the soldiers that were wounded by the UNLFA army, or the army that Idi Amin headed. And so the dictator at that time held him responsible for restoring life and ability to fight to soldiers who would otherwise have been taken out by the regime. And so he took it personally. And I remember, although I was a child, that a number of doctors were assassinated using bayonets. Wow. Of AK-47s in the late season, just before the civil war in Uganda, and those doctors were at my father's hospital. He was lucky to survive that time because he had traveled to Entebbe, which used to be the headquarters of the Ministry of Health, and so he was not murdered, right? On going back to the hospital, he realized he was on a wanted list of doctors who were also supposed to be butchered. And so he fled. And a short while later, my mother joined him. He came to Nairobi and later went to University of Michigan, and we stayed here. After he'd done his Masters of Public Health, he came back and he was working as a flying doctor with he was based at Amref near Wilson Airport, and they had this flying doctors service. So he was, flying all over East Africa those days, treating different people with medical conditions. So we stayed here as the children of a medical doctor who fled for political reasons, but also fled because of his his job and duty to country. So my father was not a politician at that time. He was much more a person practicing his profession and ostracized and stigmatized and targeted by a dictator because of the service he was doing as a medical doctor. All medical doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, which does not allow them to choose between the patients that are on their sick beds, right? And so dictators do horrible things to people. I think the difference between my father and myself is that at the time of fleeing from Uganda, he was not involved directly in national elective politics. I don't think we had elections in my country at the time. He was a professional. In my case, I have fled just after losing entry into parliament, but gaining a lot of insights into my country's politics.
Okay. So your father was, okay, all right, if I get it, Milton Obote was fighting against the army that was planning to take over. That should be Museveni or not?
No. So we had, Uganda has had a number of presidents, right? Mm-hmm. After Idi Amin Dada was ousted from power during the time of the Civil War, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. The two short-lived presidents thereafter were Godfrey Binaisa, and Lule. And then we had Obote too, right? Mm-hmm. We had a short interim government headed by Paul Muwanga, and then we had Milton Obote. So Milton Obote was our first president, and then we had Idi Amin, and then we had a few months of Binaisa and Lule and Paul Muwanga and Tito Okello Lutua, and then we had Milton Obote taking over, and then we had Yoweri Museveni Kaguta, who has been in power for decades. No wonder people your age don't know any other president apart from Idi Amin and Yoweri Museveni. That is how dismal it is.
All right, I don't know how to take that comment.
I don't think it's funny. I don't think it's funny.
I think the way you put it is funny. The fact that you're saying that, I mean, some of us don't know that there's ever been another president in Uganda apart from Museveni. Anyway, Reborn MC Chris says, hello guys watching from country 029. Kenya is the best country. It has hosted many refugees who are running away from political and peace instability in their countries. But again, let's continue praying to Kenya, because recently we have seen bad trend of politics which might put our country to political chaos. All right, that's interesting to see. Hilary Kuruita's accent is Kenyan. All right, I don't know. Maybe she's an international citizen, so you never know where she picked the accent. All right, there's a question for you, which I think I'll ask later. All right, about there's a
Did
question.
Somebody say my accent is Kenyan?
Yeah.
But I said I was here from standard 1 up to standard 4. Nilikuwa mkimbizi Kenya, eh? So a lot of what I am, if people are saying Nyanzi is a bad girl, well, you Kenyans contributed to my badness because I studied in Kenya. Mm-hmm.
So we molded you.
Yes, you contributed to what I am. No wonder one of the Kenyans identifies my accent as Kenyan. But it could be anything. My accent could be anything. It could be from anywhere. We watch TV. We imitate people that we love. Mm-hmm. My accent could be from anywhere. At least I think what's important is it's intelligible. People can understand when I speak.
All right. Thank you. All right. I think what we do is, what is the state of, you've actually been, in the center stage of Ugandan politics, and like you rightfully said, is that clearly you have an issue with the president, who you say has been there for decades. I don't understand, what's your journey? What has been your journey like? How did you get into activism? How did you get into politics? And how did you get into ruffling of all these feathers?
Right. So those are 3 questions in one. And maybe I will preface this by addressing the claim you made that I have an issue with the president of Uganda, that I have beef with the president of Uganda. And what I will do is to quickly say that I have only met Yoweri Museveni in life one time. I was undertaking military and political training, which was compulsory for students who had left high school just before we joined university in 1993, when I had completed my high school. And I went to Chankwanzi Military and Political Training School for 3 months. I was so bad at the actual military drills and the physical work, and I was punished all the time, but I was also very eloquent and perhaps the best speaker on behalf of the students. And so I was voted and appointed to address the president when he came to close the training that we had at the end of those 3 months. And so I saw him physically, and I spoke to him to thank him for this training. It was called Muchaka Muchaka at that time that we had. And for 5 minutes of my life, I was shaking through this speech that I gave to him. And all that he said in response to me was why I was wearing purple trousers, purple, the color purple. So I don't know Yoweri Museveni personally. My struggle and contestation against him is against him as a public figure, the person who occupies State House in my country, the person who has abused public resources for over 3 decades, almost 4 decades, the person who has oppressed, repressed, suppressed, and is obsessed with the abuse of human rights of Ugandans. And so I don't have any personal issues with him, but I have a lot of public disgust for Yoweri Museveni as dictator. And he wants to take 5 more years. That is appalling. That is terrible. So how did I enter this journey? Where do I start, Gerald Bitok? Gerald, are you still there?
Yes, Stella, I'm saying you start from the beginning. Every
Where
journey
is the
starts from the
beginning?
How did you get into this? How did you get into
Is
activism?
the beginning the day I was born?
No,
the day
activism,
that I was
into
born
political
a
activism.
little girl. The day that I was born a little girl is the day that my politics began.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That is when you entered
The
into political
day-
activism.
I mean, look, what do people mean when they say, when did you start your political career? I think that for those of us who are born minorities, right, life has been a struggle for day one. I think what you're asking me is, when did I get involved in national elective politics, participating? Because that I can surely tell you was in January. In January of 2020, I was a prisoner serving a sentence at Luzira Maximum Security Prison, Luzira Women's Prison. In February of 2020, that is last year, I was released upon acquittal from serving an 18-month sentence. My sentence was really based on conviction for cyber harassment of Yoweri Museveni through a Facebook post, right? So in January 2020, I was a convicted prisoner. In February 2020, I was an acquitted Ugandan, an ex-convict going back into my country. In March, we had COVID-19 and the lockdown. In April of the same month, I was admitted into hospital 2 times with kidney problems related to toxins I was fed when I was in prison. And so my journey from being a convicted prisoner, getting acquitted, facing lockdown, like our country was locked down in March of last year. And then I had 2 admissions related to failing kidneys, one in a general hospital and secondly in a private specialized hospital. That experience for me pointed to a specific call. During the COVID-19 time, Museveni promised to give us food, posho, which is ugali flour, and beans for every poor, vulnerable individual in the country. And he also promised powdered milk and sugar to lactating and pregnant women. None of this food came to my area, and women were visiting me, a recently released prisoner, and asking for food that was supposed to be catering for my children, right? In that moment of a lot of widespread urban hunger, I called upon a group of women to participate in a protest against the failure and delay of government to deliver these food supplements, this relief package for poor families. I was arrested and beaten up and thrown back into a police cell together with a few comrades. So one lady and 4 men, maybe 3 men with whom we were protesting, out of the others were arrested. And I think that build-up of I have just been released from prison because of writing about the dictator's oppression and repression and suppression in my country, 4 months based again on protesting against his failure, his government's failure to provide food supplements to poor Ugandans. I am back on the floor of a police cell. I've been beaten and brutalized by this very same police that should have been protecting me and maybe arresting the COVID-19 task force. On the floor of the police cells, this particular arrest, I remembered the multitudes of Ugandans who had visited me in prison and said to me, when you are released, Stella, you have to run for parliament. You have to run for a position. And so I thought about all my activism and my academic knowledge production and my different protestations leading up to this moment on the floor in a dirty police cell of Kampala Central Police Station. And I decided I'm going to get involved in the politics of my country simply because I believed, and I still believe, that we needed to become the changes that we were looking for. That is how I got involved into the decision that I had. Yes, to run for office. For a long time, I didn't believe that parliament was the place for me. For a long time, I was one of the greatest critics of the failings of our parliament in Uganda. But when I was on the floor in the police station during COVID-19 lockdown, I decided that if things were going to change, I had to be actively involved. And there was no going back after that. I think for me, that I became a critique of Yoweri Museveni. Perhaps in 2014, when my father, who'd been a medical doctor treating a lot of Ugandans, he'd retired round about that year. He died looking for medicine that was supposed to be provided in our public health facilities. A medical doctor who knows the sort of medical treatment he needs, who has the money to take care of himself and, buy the medicine, had to travel from a health center in our village where he had retired to another health center and then to the main national referral hospital looking for a single vial of medicine, one single vial of medicine. My father would not have died if the budgeting priorities of our government, our parliament, were really focused on the interests of public health and well-being, public welfare. However, that year my father died because there was no money for there was no money in the hospitals for medicine, although there was a lot of money for bullets and tear gas. The year after, 1 year exactly after my father's burial, my mother, coming from the day after my father's memorial service, she collapsed. And we spent about 2 hours looking for an ambulance to deliver her from home where she had fallen and take her to a hospital, which was about 10 minutes away from us. I was on the phone with her when she collapsed. She called me, and I spent about 2 hours just trying to locate an ambulance to pick her from the ground where she'd fallen outside our home. And it was friends who drove her in their private car, again to the very same National Referral Hospital in Masaka that my father died from. As she entered, right, she broke down and died. And so the failure of having ambulances or emergency transport in my country meant that my mother was dead. And yet we have so many black mambas and so many enamored vehicles and so many, all sorts of transport. The president's convoy is long, beleaguered with all sorts of vehicles, but we don't have enough ambulances to cater for an entire district to transport elderly women when they collapse. And so my interest in becoming a government critic, which is different to participating actively in national elective politics, follows directly from the deaths, unnecessary deaths, of my father and my mother simply because of budgeting priorities in Uganda. And so I think my entry onto the Ugandan scene as a critique of Yoweri Museveni begins in 2014 and 2015, when I was a child, a little girl, mourning and grieving and thinking my parents should not be in these graves. It's too early for my parents to have died. Had our government been interested, perhaps they wouldn't done, my parents wouldn't have been dead. Had my government been interested in public services, this wouldn't have happened. So 2014, my father dies. 2015, my mother dies. 2016 is the period leading up to the elections, and Makerere University is abusing my labor rights, and I stage a nude protest against the failures of the institution to uphold the Employment Act of my country, the human resource policy of Makerere University, but also I protest against the political interference of Yoweri Museveni's wife, Janet Kataha Museveni, who comes onto the scene because I've been criticizing herself and her husband and the failures of their nepotistic government. And she issues these dictates about my suspension from the university, and she gives these ultimatums later on about me being precluded and excluded from employment as a university academic staff simply because of the critiquer's offering. And so the interference of the First Lady into the independence and autonomy of a university, the oldest public university in the country, compounded or complemented and supplemented my disgust of this regime of Yoweri Museveni. In 2017, we have elections, and I am a vocal critic of the government and vocal supporter of Dr. Kizza Besigye, who was the presidential candidate for Forum for Democratic Change, which is my party. And again, in 2017, like a culmination of my disappointments in the political system of Uganda, the election is stolen, the vote is rigged, and Dr. Kizza Besigye is not sworn into office as he should have. So 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017, there are major events in my life that build up into a lot of frustration and anger and disgust and disdain and outrage towards Yoweri Museveni and his dictatorship. And so I become an unemployed and unemployable academic with time on my hands and discontent in my heart and the ability to organize and mobilize. And so I think from 2017 right up to 2018 when I was arrested, I became an active and vocal protester Yeah, so I'm a proud protester, from nude protests at the university to nude protests in the High Court to nude protests. I undertook street protests of all sorts, placard protests, sit-in protests, and more it became less about my own rights and became more about the collective rights of a number of oppressed people. That is sort of my brief journey. In 2018, I'm arrested in November, and I'm arrested a second time because I was arrested in 2017 because of a poem, well, a Facebook post I wrote in Uganda where I referred to Yoweri Museveni as Matako Butako, which is translated as Museveni is just a pair of buttocks. And I think that is the first time that I scandalously entered the political scene as a government critic. I was arrested and charged with cyber harassment and offensive communication against Yoweri Museveni. The Directorate of Public Prosecutions applied for me to be subjected to involuntary mental exam, which I was, my legal team successfully halted by applying to the Constitutional Court to ask for interpretation of an old colonial law, the Mental Treatment Act, which had an article that suggested that for anybody to criticize the colonial government at that time, they must have been mentally ill and they needed to be subjected to involuntary mental examination and then mental treatment. And I thought, Jesus, the colonialists are being reproduced in the Ugandan government. But in this case, I thought that I was empowered by having a group, an amazing pro bono legal team that understood my right as a citizen, not as a colonial subject, to defend my freedom of expression rights. And so for the first time, I took on the regime through constitutional means by applying to the Constitutional Court. So that was 2017. In 2018, November, I was arrested again for another Facebook post, this time a birthday poem, a genuine, honest gift dedicated to Yoweri Museveni, in which I use metaphors of birth and metaphors of a ghost. His mother died years ago, but I use the name Esiteri, a name very familiar to me because my name Stella was betrothed to me. It comes from Esiteri, who's my grandmother. And so when I write about Esiteri, I'm not writing only about Yoweri Museveni, but I'm writing about historical figures that have birthed both myself, Stella Nyanzi, but also Yoweri Museveni, dictator. I'm going to write metaphorically about Esiteri and her vagina and how it produced a monster. A number of people in the prosecution were unable to read beyond the vagina and the pubic hair, and they were obsessed with the genitalia, and they failed to see how these metaphors were making parallels and allusions to abuse of power. So in 2018, I was arrested, charged. I refused to apply for bail, which made it difficult for the courts to release me. I was convicted in 2019. And I was released in 2020, and I just thought I have to run for office. So that is my entry. It's a bit about activism, about my politics being very personal, being inspired by grief about my parents, but also me deciding to take and utilize my privilege and my unemployment, which was created by the regime, to speak truth back to power. And I think that the race for elective politics was an amazing moment of empowerment for me, and it matured my transformation and metamorphosis from an academic, right? The world knew me before as an academic, a highly published scholar with specialization in human sexualities, sexual and reproductive health, and sexual rights, to a protester who was not only known in Uganda, but who became an international figure. And if people say, who's one of Museveni's critics? In the last 5 years, I've been able to build that sort of political career.
All right. So you recently ran again for the Kampala seat. So what happened exactly? Because you're here, then it means something did not go right with your ambitions in running for office. What happened?
I think everything went right. Right? There are a number of objectives that people have when they're running for office, right? In my case, I say it to you that the very same year in which I was nominated by my country's electoral commission, right, is the very same year in which I was a convict at Luzira Women Maximum Security Prison, in which I was a patient at Mengo Hospital, but also Kampala International Hospital, in which we had a lockdown in my country, right? And so for me, 2020, 2021 was an amazing period because within 1 year, I went to school in how to become a politician, how to run a campaign, how to get nominated, how to negotiate for power and political office in my party, Forum for Democratic Change, where I was a nobody, right? There were so many women and men who could have participated in the elections in my political party. There were so many in line ahead of me, but I came from prison to the ballot paper. And so I think that for me, one can look at our inability as a campaign team to enter office. If that was our sole objective, then perhaps we failed dismally. But for me, I mean, of course, there's disappointment that I'm not in parliament. But having spoken with very many mentors, well, I don't have so many, but my few political mentors about what it means to run a campaign and not enter parliament, but stay alive, I realized perhaps it was one of those gifts from the divine that we only realize with hindsight, because I'm not going to be in the, is it 11th or 12th parliament that starts in May 2021 and ends in 2026. I am not going to be occupied by an electorate or constituency that has a lot of demands. I have a lot of time to devote myself to the liberation struggle outside formal parliamentary roles, which are very demanding. And so I think that we ran an amazing campaign. I was poor because all my other competitors had been free and not in prison. They had their liberty outside prison gates to fundraise and raise their social, political, and economic capital before entering the elections. I had none of that. And so we ran a bare-ass campaign, right? My presidential candidate for my party, Honorable President Patrick Oboy Amoriat, whose name is Power in short, he was running a barefoot campaign all over Uganda. In our case, my campaign was running a bare pocket campaign to which contributions were given by people who believed in our cause. And so while a number of people complain and say that women cannot participate effectively in politics without financial capital, in this period of the lockdown, right, I was able to run an effective campaign. A number of contestants withdrew from their election campaign programs and schedules. We were on the road every day that I was healthy. The only times I was not able to participate in programs was when, in solidarity with a number of arrested, actually two, Bobby Wine and Power, presidential candidates were arrested and detained, really for so-called COVID-19 regulations for scientific elections that they broke. But in solidarity with this unfairness, I suspended my campaign for 2 days. Otherwise, the beauty of learning the enormous lesson of how to run a campaign as a woman with nothing really apart from resources such as humans and finances and everything else that was given to me by supporters and colleagues and comrades, and also my political party. That's an amazing lesson. Where does one go to school to do this? I know, Gerald, you talk that you've been running campaigns, and you know how expensive it is to participate, right?
Definitely, I know.